So welcome everyone to the seminar, Can Hatred Ever Be Appropriate? Today's guest is Szanto. Szanto is working at the Universities of Jyväskylä, Finland, and University of Copenhagen. His work is mostly concerned with social ontology and philosophy of emotion, and particularly mostly working on collective emotions. And in his most recent project is about antagonistic political emotions, and in some way part of it are the lecture we had yesterday about the political resentment and the seminar we had today about hatred. He published a monograph, Bewusstsein, Intentionalität und mentale Repräsentation, Husserl und die analytische Philosophie des Geistes, and was the co-editor of volume published by Routledge, The Phenomenology of We, Discovering the We Phenomenology of Sociality, and the forthcoming volume published by Routledge, A Handbook for Philosophy of Emotions. I will just say a few words of the format of the seminar. Szanto will have around 30-minute introduction to the topic, then we will have a first panel, first free intervention, then a short break, and after it 3 more interventions, and I think we will have enough time for a general discussion at the end. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Igor. Thanks a lot, Peter, for the kind invitation, and thanks again for showing up. I really appreciate it. It was a great discussion we had, from my point of view, really productive, great discussion on yesterday's paper on ressentiment, and I think there are a lot of overlapping issues, not just that they are both antagonistic and hostile emotions, but also in the structure of the two, especially when it comes to this collectivization aspect that is prevalent in both, and especially so, as you might know from the paper on hatred, in the case of hatred. Before we start, as Igor mentioned, what I want to do is to have a really just a one-slide summary of the paper, and it's really just 2 ideas out of the paper that I want to just mention, and then move a little bit away from the paper to have a little bit of background for the discussion that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, and which is not dealt with in the paper itself. So in order to have a bit of background about this specific topic of appropriateness of emotions in general and hatred in specific, I will briefly discuss some literature and also my idea of how I think would be best to conceive of appropriateness here in this context, and specifically also with regard to hatred, and so that we also have then a background for the discussion of this specific topic of appropriateness. Very briefly, so what I reread now the article, and I haven't read it for a while. Can you see more or less? Am I also not in the way of? So, as you all know, I guess, from the paper, and it's way more complicated. I've just reread it recently, and it is quite a complicated argument, so this doesn't really do justice to it, but I think these are the most important features also for today. 2 ideas from the paper. One is that the effective intentionality of hatred is distinctive. This feature is shared with some other antagonistic emotions like ressentiment, but I think it is still distinctively different and more radical in hatred, namely the idea that it has this overgeneralizing of the target and of the intentional object of the attitude in what it means here. What I tried to elaborate is overgeneralization as a certain form of collectivization, meaning that the target is shifting and oscillating between individuals construed as so the individuals are targeted in a in a global stereotyped fashion, and not just that, but that there is an inherent tendency to kind of shift the targets between, or the targets is oscillating between individuals, proxies of groups, and whole groups as such. So there is no determinate target in that sense of hatred. But it is also indeterminate in a kind of a related sense, but which is not quite the same. It's kind of a different aspect of this indeterminacy, namely that it has what I have metaphorically called a blurred affective focus. So I try to specify that in the sense that the subject has no specific, so the hate worthiness of the target, which is the formal object, has no real import for the subject, for the hater, and to explain how it's still and yet has, because you might then wonder, and this is kind of in the middle part of the paper, how then to explain that hatred does have an effective weight and has a very extreme effective also effective weight in the sense that it motivates also potentially extreme behavior. How to explain that? I was trying to argue that hatred as an attitude derives its effective weight not from the focus and not from the hate-worthy properties, which are fuzzy, blurry, but from the sheer commitment to the attitude itself. And this is also the reason why hatred becomes sediment, or is prone, very much prone, unlike other emotions, like for example anger or fear also maybe, and many other sentiments and emotions. The reason why hatred is prone to habitualization and sedimentation and become a robust attitude, because the hater kind of derives the whole effective focus from simply the commitment to the attitude, to maintaining and to upholding the attitude itself. And this is combined or facilitated, and this is, I think, similar in ressentiment, as I tried to analyze yesterday, by a double kind of attachment also in the sense of a commitment, and an attachment of also an effective alignment in two ways: an alignment with the target, which is still a fuzzy and overgeneralized other, and a negative alignment also not just with the target but also with one's own in-group with whom one shares this commitment to hate others. And this in-group alignment and this, what I then call a shared commitment to hate, this facilitates and reinforces also the effective import of individuals and groups' attitude. I leave it at that. This is really very sketchy, and I hope that all of this has become way clearer and better argued for in the paper, which is quite long also. So for those of you who have read the paper, I hope that these points are more convincing, but of course all of this stands to discussion, and I'm really curious to hear your criticisms and comments on this, what I've just said. But now let's move on to really a different issue that I'm currently especially interested in, and notice again, none of this has been, except in footnotes or as caveats, being dealt with in the paper itself. So this is really, I take the paper to be the basis for eventually discussing these issues today, and also maybe hopefully in some other paper. Now there are two very different lines of inquiry or issues with regard to what might be called generally appropriateness of emotions and hatred in specifically. And this goes for many other sentiments and emotions. Here I try to shape it around hatred mostly, but also talk in general terms about this appropriateness issue. And the first, so two very different general topics. The first, appropriateness in the sense of moral and or normative function, or status, or so here appropriateness really means moral and or normative, maybe in a somewhat broader sense, appropriateness. The question here is, and I will go into that in a moment, the question here is basically, is there some ethically right, ethically appropriate good in that sense hatred? Can hatred ever be ethically appropriate, and if not, why actually is hatred morally wrong to bear, to have, to nourish, to maintain, etc.? Or if it's not, what is the legitimate, corrective, retributive, maybe socio-normative function of hatred? If it has any, like many other antagonistic or hostile or social emotions like resentment, indignation, contempt, according to most authors today at least do have. So they do have these legitimate corrective and retributive and etc. functions. The second issue, and this is really something different, I think, and I think this, and basically this distinction between these two lines of inquiry has been most saliently and most clearly, I think, been put on the table by two authors, by Darms and Jacobson, in a paper from 2000 called The Moralistic Fallacy, on the appropriateness of, or on the fittingness of emotions, I think it's called. I come back to this paper. And the second issue, and this is very, and I have prepared way more, but it will get too long, as you will see, so I will skip a lot of this. I will skip the emotional truths and the accuracy account probably. But it's a whole line of inquiry: in what sense can emotions be appropriate or not appropriate in terms of something else than moral and normative function, in terms of what Darms and Jacobson call fittingness and others call emotional truths, etc. And this, so just to give you a little bit more detail. Now, the first issue, moral and normative appropriateness. There is not much literature on that. There is actually very little. As far as I can see, not much more than 3-4 authors working on that. A classical one, but where it's not so clear-cut. Scheler, what he really says, it's not very systematic. And Hans Bernhard Schmidt, who was also here, you know his work, he has just, it's I think on academia also, or the academia I do, but it will be forthcoming in this Routledge handbook that I'm co-editing, a paper which is called Hatred of Evil, and this is what I have in mind here. So this is Hans Bernhard Schmidt's paper, and he takes also his cue partly from Scheler. So the question is, can hatred be morally or normatively appropriate? And according to Scheler, this is mostly Scheler, hatred cannot, because it does not recognize or grasp moral wrongs as the evil as they are. Basically because it doesn't have a value disclosive function for Scheler. He says, and this is a quote, it's basically not in the sense of typical emotions, value feelings, as value feelings, unintentional value feeling as such, hatred. It is, as he says, an original and direct emotional behavior towards a value content that excludes reception of values, of value and value judgment assessment. So it is in a way a reaction to some kind of value, but it is not assessing and receiving it in the sense as other emotions do. And also, by the way, also ressentiment doesn't do that, have discussed yesterday, according to Scheler. It aims rather to eliminate and poison moral discourse and behavior. So hatred is kind of something that disrupts moral discourse and just poisons. It has no corrective and just a destructive function. And part of the reason is, and this is I think very interesting, and I haven't really mentioned that so much in the paper actually, but that's an interesting thought, that it is also destructive and poisoning hatred because it continuously seeks out the allegedly hate-worthy features in others. It's not a reaction to a specific harm, as we know, and there most people agree. Basically everybody agrees that it's not a specific targeting specific harms, but globally assesses a person. But Scheler also makes clear that it kind of seeks out ever more bad features, evil features, even if they are not there, it makes it up, etc. And in that sense it just poisons the whole moral behavior and discourse. But now Hans Bernhard Schmidt makes a really, I think, very interesting distinction with regard to this, partly a little bit building on Scheler, but going beyond that, discussing also Aquinas a lot, etc. Namely between hatred of action and agent hatred. And the whole argument of Bernhard Schmidt is basically that the problem with hatred of evil is, on the one hand, that there is no such thing probably as evil, but there might be maybe evil actions. But the problem with hatred of evil is that it targets not just evil actions, but the person as evil. And this is inappropriate. So it kind of assumes that there is some global feature of persons, unchangeable, unchanging, that just has to be destroyed. And that the problem is that hatred of evil action might be appropriate, but the problem is that is not hatred, because hatred doesn't target simply specific actions, but the persons as such, as evil. And here is what he says. I read it just fast because I think this is really interesting. So this is from this forthcoming paper. Generalized hatred necessarily implicates individuals and sometimes implicates them in a particularly problematic stereotypical way. This is what I've also tried to show. And hatred of acts tends to implicate agents, and while hate of agents might be problematic in many ways, this is particularly obvious where the agents in question are persons. So hatred of acts implicates agents as such, as evil. Perhaps there is a point that can be made with regards to some types of deficient group agents. With deficient group agents, there seems to be nothing wrong in putting out of existence corporations and institutions that are systematically geared towards the bad and organized in a way that makes them unsuited for reform. He refers to another unpublished paper. It might be righteous and laudable to hate them, to hate group agents, if the members are not implicated in hate of group agents in the way they are implicated in Aristotelian hate of classes. So this Aristotelian, we can discuss that maybe later, where the thief as member of a class of thieves would be also hated in Aristotle. That's what he means here. But the important point here is that he thinks that the problem is that hatred of acts tends to implicate the agents as evil and as hate-worthy, and this is problematic, as he argues in this paper. But there might be some types of agents where it's actually laudable to hate them if they are doing wrong, namely group agents. Then there is the only other two papers or series of papers, and they are really interesting, are by Jeffrey Murphy and Gene Hampton in a joint book that they wrote with individual papers on actually forgiveness and mercy, but they have 2 or 3 papers on hatred there, which is really, really great, from the 80s. And they try to argue actually, but very cautiously and with many restrictions, with too many restrictions, I think, for something they call retributive or Gene Hampton moral hatred. And they say this is a justified desire, so it's the desire here, this attitude is kind of a desire that perpetrators get the punishment they morally deserve. And in that sense it is justified, but it should be, as also Murphy points out, should be conceived as a very, very much constrained form of hatred, which is not ethically demanded. So it is not like resentment that might be in certain cases ethically, or contempt maybe even demanded. Hatred certainly is not such an ethically demanded stance, and it is also not a virtue, he tries to say, but it is not necessarily a vice either. So it is not a vice to hate, but under grave circumstances, and they are very specific circumstances, for example, vis-à-vis tortures or racist murderers, etc. Hatred is understandable and in principle also justified if it is constrained. But the problem is, and he points out in this paper, Murphy especially, in this earlier paper, that there are many reasons, and he refers to Kant and other authors and Adam Smith, that moral decency and the too high costs for the individual agents, but also for society, if hatred is really something that is nourished and maintained for individuals, this retributive hatred, we should actually refrain from it. So it might be in principle justified, but everything actually speaks against it, also morally and socially, and it is dangerous to not constrain it in a way that actually we shouldn't in the end have it, even though it is understandable. And here, this is from a later paper. I again read it because this is, I think, quite telling how he conceives of it. So what would that constrainments be? Let us then confine ourselves to cases in which, as a hater, I wish for the hated person to live a life of unhappiness to the highest degree possible that is consistent with moral side constraints. I want him, let us say, to lose his fortune and fall into poverty, to be publicly disgraced, abandoned by all his friends, perhaps even to experience some unpleasant but not tortures, illnesses and disabilities, but always with an alert mind. And if his evil actions have been criminal, to suffer an appropriate prison term. And now we ask, am I a bad person? So is it a vice for having such a desire? Is hatred even of this constraint sort a serious vice of character? And he argues that it is not. And again, it's in cases where it is very serious. So this person, for example, has murdered somebody that is dear to me, or has committed a socially really evil act or something like that. Okay. Coming to the second, and I will skip all the rest that I'm discussing. There are many other accounts. I speak here about 4 models, and it's not these 4 models, but this is just one of the 4, but I will skip the other 3 and just discuss this. So this is the paper I already mentioned, Darms and Jacobson, account of fittingness of emotions, and they don't speak at all about hatred. They speak about amusement, funniness, envy, etc. But I think it's very useful to view all kinds of emotions and sentiments, also hatred, along these lines. So they distinguish inappropriateness in 4 different senses. And they were, I think, as far as I know, the first to have really made these really interesting distinctions. The first is prudential considerations. So really practical rationality, if you want, in a non-moral sense. It has no moral or normative, in narrower sense, normative bearing. So it is, an example would be, it is better not to be amused about somebody else's behavior, say your boss's behavior, when you and express that and talk about your amusement with your peers and etc., in a hiring process where you need her support to hire you. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. So it's just not very clever to do. There's nothing wrong with it, but very different, the moral rightness and appropriateness. So here an example, I think a good example, and Sheila uses examples like this, by the way, already. Even though he was in other senses definitely a sexist, so don't want to defend him in that, but this example of a sexist joke or inappropriate, you find it in Sheila too. But sticking to the amusement and funniness, so it's this kind of same kind of emotion, if you will, or affective state that is at stake as being amused about your boss's behavior. It's not good, not appropriate, not right to find sexist jokes funny. Even though, and that's the whole point, even though you might find them funny, and even though they might be funny in some sense. It's a tricky question what that actually that means that they are funny. And this is something that is very tricky in the paper of them, but the intuition is at least that there seems to be a difference between the actual funniness of the joke and the appropriateness of finding it funny. But then there is a third sense that it is what they say all unreasonable, so all considered reasonable or not. And that means that it is both wrong and unreasonable. So everything considered it's really just not right. And I think really a good example here is, I think they give that example themselves as far as I remember. Being amused at a funeral even though something is really wrong. I mean, something tragicomic happens, I don't know. Somebody falls into the graves, let's say. A slapstick kind of thing happens, which might be funny and tragicomic, but it's just not, seems not right. Whether you then laugh or not, that's another matter, but it seems really not right and also not reasonable to do so. You will be, you will be embarrassed if you do that afterwards, for sure. And this is the whole point. They distinguish from all these senses, and this is what I want to get at, what they call fittingness. So they distinguish this appropriateness and fittingness. And fittingness would be an emotion fits if the emotion's object, intentional object, has the evaluative properties or features that the emotion presents to the emoter. So in these examples, but I will have another example, if the joke is funny to the emoter, would be appears funny and actually is funny. That's the point here, and that has nothing to do with prudential considerations, with moral considerations, etc. And this has to do with, they distinguish then with regard to fittingness, two aspects of fittingness: the size and the shape of emotions. The shape, an emotion is fitting according to the shape if the object lacks or does have the specific evaluative features that the emotion pertains to present, or it is or if according to the size emotions are fitting or unfitting, if the emotion is an overreaction or fits actually this evaluative property. And just an example, in envy, so if the thing regarding the shape, envy would be unfitting if I envy something there isn't such a thing that I'm envying. So my rival, I'm envying, I don't know, the great car that he has, for example, but it's actually not a great car at all. It doesn't even work, and I should have known, or it's actually not really better than what I have. And regarding to the size, if the others the good I'm envying is actually almost as good as mine, but my envy is over-consuming. I'm just glowing with it. I consecrate all my efforts into getting that, and it's really makes my life miserable, and that would be really unfitting in that sense. I will skip all these other accounts. So there are very complicated accounts of emotional accuracy, emotional truth, combined accounts of emotional truth. If you are interested in this topic further, the best paper I know in this topic that takes into account all these others is by Mikko Salmela, called Emotional Truth. I find it really great. He has also a book actually that is also called Emotional Truth. No, True Emotions. That takes up these issues also, but the paper is really, really nice. But I want to close with something that you have heard in part either in yesterday's talk, and in part this is something that I allude to at least in the paper, in this hatred paper. So what I would want to suggest is to, in a way, sharpen and reformulate also in more subjective terms, as it were, in less objective value realist terms, Darms and Jacobson's view on fittingness in a different kind of framework, and conceive of appropriateness as what Bennett Helm calls focal commitment, and what others, Pugmire for example, and Brewer and others, and I have worked on that in another paper, call emotional authenticity or appropriateness in this sense of authentic emotions. And the question here is, the question of appropriateness is a question whether the focus of the emotion does or does not pick out those evaluative features, not those that the object has or doesn't have, objectively speaking, whether the joke is funny or not, because how to decide, and do we need value realism there in order to decide it? So not in these terms, but whether the focus picks out those evaluative features of the object that really matter actually to the subject in having those emotions, and to kind of, I mean, this would be way more complicated than here, so just some ideas. So Helm has this idea that you somewhat have in the paper on hatred also, that there is that emotions involve a commitment to the focus of the emotion, and this is really a normative commitment, but not a moral commitment necessarily. In a way it is, but at first at least it is normative in the sense that if you really have that emotion, if it is an authentic feeling in that sense, you ought to have or have not certain other emotions with the same focus. So for example, if you, and this is a whole pattern, and then he kind of argues that this focal commitment construes also something like rational interconnections between emotions. An example, if you really love, I don't know, I mean, they're very banal examples. If you are really proud of the achievement of your daughter, say for example at a certain contest, and this pride is really something that is not just you. Not just say that because you are a parent and you think you ought to say such things, that you are really proud of your daughter, or tell her that you are really. But if you do that, then you are also committed, because you are committed to her well-being, to her success, to her flourishing with regard to a certain thing, I don't know, that she plays basketball, say well, or whatever, then you ought not feel complete ignorance and complete annoyance in going to the celebration of her victory, for example. There would be something wrong with one of those stances. So they hang together because the focus is the same. You are proud of the achievement of her winning with her team, for example. And then you ought at least not be annoyed of needing to take an hour to sit with her and celebrate her victory. Because it has the same focus, and you ought to also be prepared to act on behalf of this commitment of your emotion of pride, and to entertain also maybe according desires in her. Desire that she wins in the next game or whatever. How we elaborate, or how we kind of find out, and this was a discussion we had yesterday already a little bit, whether now our own or others' emotions in that sense are appropriate in this sense, or authentic as it were, can only be assessed by a very complex form of emotional self-elaboration, which is elaborating what is my focus, which emotions fit with the focus or not, fit together, etc. Am I prepared to act? And this is a lifelong process in a way, in certain sense. I will actually skip that, I think. I will skip that. So another author who is really interesting, if you're interested in, especially in this kind of soundness, authenticity, I think the best account of this type of analysis, in a way, that I'm suggesting in a way, is this wonderful book. It's one of my favorite books. It's probably my favorite book in philosophy of emotion. The book by Pugmire, 2005, especially this latter book called Sound Emotions. It's an incredibly beautifully written book also, but I'll skip that because we are very pressed with time. And now just closing with it's really just hypothesis and open questions. This would be something we could discuss, but we can discuss, of course, other issues just as well. So my hypothesis is, and I have to think more about this, but is that hatred can only be ethical, in a sense, morally legitimate or normatively appropriate, vis-a-vis corporations or group agents. Maybe collective agents, so maybe it's not just corporate agents, but evil collectives. I think that might be also right, exactly in the way that Hans-Bernhard Schmidt suggests. So I think this is the only sense in which it is morally legitimate, and in which it is also normatively appropriate and actually demanded also. So I would really go as far as to say, as Hans-Bernhard Schmidt, that we actually have a duty, maybe not a duty, but we are required, at least, let's say, to hate, in the sense of also enacting that hate, destroying in certain cases, or hedging completely, or dissolving certain evil agents. And evil, I mean here by those who do significant harm to persons and to groups of persons. But due to its structural features, and these are those that I hope to have discussed in the paper, in the written paper, none of the other senses, also not in the sense of fittingness or the other senses, can hatred be ever appropriate. And we can discuss that. And then the open question, where I'm really not sure what to say. We should discuss that, I guess. Whether there could be something like authentic, in this latter sense, collectives hatred in the sense of intergroups. So can really groups commit themselves specifically to hatred of other groups as group agents? Whether that could be kind of an appropriate stance, I don't know. Notwithstanding the issue that it is dangerous. But whether it could be appropriate in this other sense, But again, this is really just a thought I had recently. Thanks a lot. This is for the part, very long introduction, but thank you. Maybe I sit down.
Yeah, immediately start with the first panel of the agenda. Shortly introduce the first three panelists. It's Ratko Jovanov. Ratko earned his PhD also in Wien and on Hegel, and later worked on social ontology, having some research projects in Istanbul and in Wien with Bernhard Schmidt. Then Mark Loschons. Mark earned his PhD on Husserl and Bergson on time, but now it's more focused also on analytical metaphysics and theory of relations. And Đurđa Trajković, she earned her PhD at Madison, but on Hispanistic, but currently also working on feminist theories, post-colonial studies. So, Rasko, please.
Thank you, Igor. So, I read only a few works on theory of emotions, and mostly Bernhard Schmidt's works on. Okay, a few remarks. A phenomenon of collective emotions isn't new and discovered even with the latest research in social ontology. Already with Scheler and his notion of Einfühlung or Mitgefühl, I don't know the proper word in English. We have been introduced to the collectivity of emotions or shared emotions. I don't know, do you insist on the difference between shared and collective emotions? I haven't saw it in your work. And on that difference since, for example, Bernhard Schmidt, difference between shared and collective intentionality or emotions. But I think that it can be useful here for your research. Scheller's famous example of two parents who are mourning for their child is a classical example of shared emotions. Those shared emotions are merely ad hoc emotions, and they always take a place in the same place or in the same space. But look on the example of football hooligans and or traditionally rivalry between two football clubs. I find it that it is more an example of collective emotions, although the agents doesn't need to be in the same place and strictly together. Because agents who are carrying same emotions can express them at their home alone or in the streets. Well, for football hooligans, that is quite clear. And the same goes for the hate against migrants today. So I guess this difference could be useful for you, especially when you write in this paper, like other affective states, hatred too can, under suitable circumstances and given certain robust requirements of affective sharing, be realized jointly. And second, if I am correct, Bernhard Schmidt inspired a so-called phenomenological turn in philosophy of emotions. I think he did it, I'm not sure. And he denies that shared emotions could serve as constitutional basis for collective intentionality. How do you see your position in opposition to Schmidt's theory? That is, what is the connection between affective and collective intentionality if we, as you write, cannot grasp the affective phenomenology of hatred without understanding its international structure? And so when you write here on shared commitment, that means to hate or emotions constitutes a group. That means that your theory doesn't need a notion of collective intentionality at all, if I'm seeing it correctly. And about the last one, that hatred can be ethically only against the corporations or group agents. What do you think? Why then a hatred cannot be ethically also against proxy agents? Isn't Hitler Hitler was a proxy agent, yes? So I think that can only be justified. Okay, and to end with my first remarks, what is the object of hatred? Is it type or token? If it's type, then hatred should have some qualitative properties shared by agents, group agents. Okay, thank you. That's my few remarks.
Thanks, that's great. Yeah.
Do you want to immediately transfer to have all the questions?
I don't know, maybe, isn't it maybe easier immediately? I don't know. How do you do it usually? Might be maybe too many questions. Yeah, if that's okay. Thanks a lot. These are all really great points. It's really helpful. I tried to go through them in the order that you post them. So about the first issue, I fully agree with you, and I fully agree with Schmidt. And I don't mention this in this paper at all, this distinction. Actually, I've myself made exactly this distinction in another paper on collective emotions. So where I use also the labels, actually not referring there, I'm not sure whether Schmidt had named this distinction back then, like with these terms, I don't know, but in any case I make exactly this distinction myself and say that it is very important to distinguish between shared and collective emotions. And shared would precisely be those cases where you have face-to-face interaction, physical proximity, probably embodied cues that aid, etc. The Scheler example would be the typical good example for shared, but not for collective. And I think both are possible and both are also distinct in a way. I think also they shared a certain key features, namely a sharedness of the focus, etc. So there are also very important not just similarities, but shared features between shared and collective emotions. But nonetheless has to be distinguished. But I haven't made this distinction here in this paper because I wanted to refrain, simply because it would have been too much. It's already a very complicated and kind of overloading paper in a way. To deal also with collective realizations of hatred or shared realizations of hatred. And that's why I didn't make that distinction, because I'm not talking about either shared or collective hatred in that sense anyway in the paper. So it's really collaborative or group level phenomena rather that I was speaking of. That doesn't mean that I don't think there is collective, like truly collective or truly shared hatred. And I think there is, but I haven't discussed that in that paper. This brings me, I think, very nicely, and has also brought you to the second point, namely about the whether effective intentionality and shared effective intentionality and collective effective intentionality is necessary for collective intentionality in general, if I understood you correctly. And I would also agree that it is not necessary. It is at most, but I do think that it is actually, in fact, facilitating, helping, reinforcing collective intentionality. So, for example, collective beliefs, endorsement of collective beliefs, or shared beliefs also in a group are significantly aided and facilitated if there are also underlying shared effective intentionality among the group members, but it is not necessary for there to be, or a joint action can be performed without there being any shared emotions. The same goes here for shared commitments. I tried to, but probably I wasn't clear enough. I think I have a footnote or something on that, or some caveat when I use the term shared commitment in this hatred paper. By shared commitment, it's not a great term, I admit, and it's probably misleading, but I try to distinguish it from proper collective intentionality. So this is not a shared commitment in the sense of Gilbert, for example, a joint commitment to do something together or to feel something together. It's really just that we interpersonally and collaboratively in a group context, each of us commits to the hatred which reinforces this group level tendency and which aligns individuals with the group.
And then you don't need collective intentionality.
Exactly. No. I wouldn't say at this level, not yet. I think it typically goes hand in hand with it, but not necessarily. So the examples, you used that example too, in a way. I mean, you know, in a political context, hating refugees, for example, in a very loose populist right-wing movement where I'm not really very robustly group identifying, but I still vote for these issues, etc. There is no real collectivity here. At the same time, my own stance and other stance, and through blogs and publications and party speeches, etc., kind of reinforces a sense of us in a way, without necessarily that we acting really as one, as it would be needed for collective intentionality. And then the third question, that's a great point, I think, and I think you're right, and I have to think about that more. But in principle, I would agree with you, and I haven't really considered that, which I should have in the talk I just did. The proxy, the proxy issue, exactly. So I don't quite know. So I tend to agree, but I think we have to probably, I would go that way, a kind of a combination of this Murphy constraining hatred with Schmid's position. What I mean by that, so if you remember from the quote in Schmid, he says that we can very well hate group agents, but only if, here I think, but only it might be righteous and laudable to hate them, so group agents, if the members are not implicated in hate of group agents in the way they are implicated in this sense. And what exactly does that mean? Yes, if they are really proxies, and if we hate them as proxies, as evil persons as proxies of their groups, enacting also their groups like Hitler, enacting Nazi ideology, etc., then yes, but we have to constrain it in that way, that they are really hated as evil, as evil exemplars of an ideology, say, or whatever, or of corporation or something. I mean, I mean, maybe a better example, because it's not so extreme, hating Zuckerberg, for example, Mark Zuckerberg as the head CEO and founder of Facebook. Yes and no, in a way. Yes, in a way, as the CEO of Facebook, but killing him is another. I mean, killing the person and thinking that Mark Zuckerberg as this person, individual who he is evil, is another matter, and I would think that this is not morally appropriate. But yes, as a CEO of Facebook, we can discuss. It's maybe not a good example, but I think, so in a way we should combine probably very cautiously.
Because Zuckerberg then is a proxy of some evil values, or wrong values. So I'm not sure there is a difference. We have to think about it.
You're not sure whether there is or that there is a difference between evil and...
I mean, between Zuckerberg and Hitler there is a...
No, of course. That's why I shifted the example, and I also don't want to conflate them. They are obviously very different examples. But I think it's also good to look at not the most extreme examples, but those that are... so obviously I don't want to say that they are the same, they are precisely different, but in some sense they might be similar, that we should especially, in both cases, distinguish the agent as evil still, and the agent as a proxy of a group agent, let's put it that way. And the agent as a proxy of a group agent, or the agent as just an individual that happens to be a member or an important functionary of that group. And then type and token, that's also a good question, and good that you raised it. So your question was whether the hate-worthy properties or so are...
If hatred is a type, then the agents should share the same qualitative properties.
Yeah.
And I think that's more demanding theory of hatred than...
Yes, and I would say that it is a type, but I think we need to be more careful than just at the type and token distinction. And this is what I tried to do with Aquinas on the one hand in this paper, and this Hadrian's analysis. So type alone I think is not enough, because we have to distinguish then this issue whether we hate something, some just common feature that is some kind of whatever, a species, the evil deed, or I don't know what, that is somehow, in which somehow all token, the individual agents somehow participate weirdly. It's kind of weird metaphysically how this should work. And I think this would be wrong way to put it. And this is what I think Aquinas is really good in saying, that when Aristotle speaks of the class of thieves that I hate, that this thief is a member of, it's not that I simply hate the thief as some kind of falling under the category of some abstract property, but I hate the property as exemplified by each and every one. And that's also this generalization tendency, because I attribute this property to each and every member of that class, whether or not they actually have it or not. And that's actually this generalization. So I hate all Palestinians or all Jews or whatever, or all women, because allegedly they all have something in common. Yeah. But I don't hate, this woman simply because there's some abstract concept, I don't know, femininity or whatever it is, that is hate-worthy, and then I somehow subsume this individual, and that's not how it works. I have something that I see in every individual as a common property. So in type, in that sense, yes, but I think in some sense it's also this token issue also important, that I hate every token that realizes that type, as it were.
Yeah, it's more with the physical question.
Yeah, no, but it is I think really good question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Mark?
It was a pleasure reading your paper in Hate We Trust. It is truly inspiring and conceptually rigorous. I will have two short comments or questions. One concerns the reflexivity of hatred, and the other is about the differential dynamics of hatred, so to say. So the first question is whether hatred can be reflexive. Can one hate hatred itself? Or more generally, can we get rid of certain forms of hatred through reflexivity? Given that hatred is, as you put it, a habitualized attitude with indeterminacy, it is not easy to see how does the relation between hatred and reflexivity function. We feel helpless regarding hatred because of essential reasons. Still, here are many important thinkers who seem to suggest that there is a relation between reflexivity and hatred. For instance, Kant claims that hatred is legitimate in at least one case, when we hate sins, including, in the end, hatred as well. Sartre even uses the formula, or imperative, hatred must be hated. And he also says that I have to hate the other's hatred towards others. So this is one part of the question. Can hatred be at a reflexive level, where it is directed towards itself, towards to hatred itself? Can one hate hatred? The more general part of the question is, if hatred is a habitualized attitude, an attitude that has addictive, non-reflexive features, can we get rid of it through purely reflexive mental acts, or we always need a slow and careful work of dehabitualization or counter-habitualization? Am I able at all to say to myself, I must hate person A more, or on the contrary, I shouldn't hate person B at all? Is this, in its banality, possible, or these would mostly be paradoxical, unimaginable cases? It is worth mentioning that there are certain ethical traditions that emphasize reflexive work, or reflexive work on or against hatred. For example, the ancient Jewish ethical tradition that rejects hatred towards individuals but accepts hatred towards total collective enemies gives special importance to reflexivity. According to this tradition, in certain cases, you have to get rid of hatred through reflection. But in other cases, when the enemy wants to destroy you and your community, you have to learn to hate. Again, this is a reflexive move. There are even thinkers who suggest that the force of reflexivity regarding hatred could be so effective that humanity will so completely get rid of hatred as such. Günther Anders, in his classical Obsolescence of Humankind, even claims that hatred might soon become an outdated, obsolete, primitively distorted attitude, not only because people will laugh at those who still hate in an enlightened way, but also because in our society the technical, calculative strategies take the place of hatred. According to Anders, instead of hatred, today we have to speak of systematized indifference. The book was, of course, written a long, long time ago. So, to sum it up, the first question is, well, first I would like to hear more about the relation between hatred and reflexivity. As for my second comment, I would like to mention an interesting case which might be still unknown in international literature on hatred. Perhaps I'm wrong. In 2006 and in 2007, a survey was conducted in Hungary, a survey concerning xenophobia. The researchers also listed a completely fictive community that has never existed. They called them the Piraeus community. One of the questions in the survey was, the members of which ethnic communities would you allow to enter Hungary as immigrants? Now, according to the results, about 59 of the respondents claimed that Hungary should not allow the Piraeus people to enter Hungary as immigrants. They will not enter ever, obviously. But what is even more exciting is that this number, 59%, was relatively close to the rejection toward ethnic communities that really exist and who are rejected the most: Arabs, Russians, Romanians, and Chinese. The completely fictive community was almost on the same level as the really existing ones. You seem to claim that hatred is mostly based on overgeneralization. I think this case might be interesting because in a certain way there is no overgeneralization at all. and no collectivization or essentialization of the target as a further effect. I'm sure that almost none of the respondents imagined various people by participating in the survey, and nobody had a specific feeling of dependence from them. There was no time to construct any stereotype of them. What happened is that the various people, as an empty signifier, took their place in a complex system of meanings. This mechanism can remind us of the classical structuralist thesis according to which meanings are not substantial entities but have their functional role in a structural differential system. This is why I like the most when you say that, I quote, the targets of hatred are hence replaceable by any other individual exemplifying the same stereotype negative properties. Except from this last remark, I can totally agree. The objects of hatred can truly function as pure, empty, flexible, completely indeterminate and replaceable signifiers. And this makes hatred even more dangerous, in fact. But does it perhaps also distantiate us from the effective theory of hatred? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. That's a really great point. Very difficult ones because I haven't thought much about it, and that's why they are also very interesting. First, to the reflexivity. So you distinguished, in, as far as I understood, in some sense, two issues there with the reflexivity. One is whether we can and should hate hatred or other forms of, for example, cognate kind of evils that hatred targets, like sin, for example. Shouldn't we hate sin, or the sin of hating also? And the other issue was how the reflexivity works in the sense of getting rid of hatred, as it were. So, because it has this tendency of habitualization. So, to the first aspect of reflex, and I find it is a great idea and an important topic, and I haven't considered it at all in the paper, or also not really in this talk now, this reflexivity issue. I think in the sense of hating hatred, I would say it is possible and we should do it. I'm just not sure whether it's really so the kind of the hatred that hates the attitude is really the same, has the same kind of effective intentional structure, or whether it's really a moral stance rather. This is probably what I would tend to say, but I have to think more about that. But my intuition would be that kind of the obligation, if it is any, or the requirement, if it is any, and that Kant, for example, speaks about to hate hatred and to hate the hatred of one's own, but also the hatred of others towards the third parties, is rather really a moral stance. So that we take a moral attitude stance that is not necessarily effective or not in the same sense as the initial stance of hating, which has really this existential, also existentially sometimes transforming character, this alignment, this obsession, as you also mentioned, this addiction to the target. And I think in the case of hating those who hate, or hating yourself, not hating yourself for hating, but hating your own hater, is not in the same way like this consuming, or potentially at least consuming stance as the hatred that is only concerned with these others and with this demarcation between in-groups and all. But I'm not sure. Maybe I'm too quick on that. Yeah, we should and can discuss that, I think, further. To the issue, and I think this is really important to raise, and I haven't done that. So thanks for raising that, with the reflexivity in the sense of how to get rid of it or how to dehabitualize it. And I think definitely that you're right, that because it sediments itself, and really think of the cases, I think they are the most telling about this sedimentation of hatred, or these cultures of hatred, and I mentioned that in the paper, of vendetta cultures also. Let's not just think about, right-wing populism or racism or these things. It's also probably good examples, but I think the most clear-cut examples are really vendetta cultures, where hatred is inherited from generation to generation, where the harms done to the third, fourth, fifth generation nobody knows even what it was, and it's often really just families who hate, and they kill each other, and it really still exists. I mean, it's rare, and it's not a prevalent phenomenon, luckily, but it's even today still exists. I mean, even in some small communities in Europe, in Greece, in Crete, or Sicily, in some ways. And I'm not saying that only this inherited hatred plays a role there. There might be other factors, but they do still. And what that just shows is that it's so deeply habitualized that it's just almost automatically, it's really inherited, basically. And I'm not meaning genetically, obviously, but through rituals, through symbols, through traditions, through discourse, etc. And to get rid of that, and especially on more complex social levels of cultures of hatred, and more complex political conflicts, where it's also cross-generational and inherited. Think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, is a generation-long process, just as much. And re-education, cultivation of other sentiments, etc. And just as so, the dehabitualization has to be a gradual process that takes often, unfortunately, generations. There was the point about, so you mentioned also both this ancient Jewish tradition of not getting so cultivating the collective form of hatred versus trying to get rid of the individual one and trying to eliminate it completely, this interpersonal hatred, or in this individual form, but cultivating even the collective one if it is needed, if, for example, our group is in danger. And this, in a way only, I would say, fits well with my analysis, that actually interpersonal hatred is, in the pure sense or in the paradigmatic sense, not even really possible, or at least not, it tends to generalize anyway. On the other hand, and this is something that I discussed maybe a little bit in the talk today, we have to be also very cautious in cultivating this intergroup hatred. So I would say, again, I mean, this is the point that I already mentioned. Yes, we should cultivate it in certain sense when it's corporations and group agents, but we have to be also very wary how we do that, and very cautious, because it might implicate also members who are just members by chance of those groups, and yeah, this is the issue we just discussed. And I find it interesting, this Anders distinction between kind of the primitive form of hatred, as it were, that is outdated seemingly, and then the more systematic kind of maybe not called hatred, but exploitation and destruction that we have all kinds of technological means for. I'm working on a paper which is different, but kind of what fits this topic on distrust, actually, where I want to argue, and that's, we'll have to look at this actually in this context also. So my point there would be, and this I think fits that quite well with hatred, that distrust towards a certain form of deep distrust that others want to destroy me is irrational in the interpersonal case, save psychopathological case. So to put it bluntly, me distrusting and going around and distrusting that other individuals will want to really destroy me and rip me off of my personality and of my personhood and humankind is inappropriate, irrational in the sense of inappropriate. It would be inappropriate to assume that on the interpersonal level this would happen. But it is very appropriate stance, unfortunately, vis-a-vis group agents or corporations which do that all the time by this systematic technological exploitation of humans, or human individuals. And I could imagine that this could work also in a similar way of hatred. So this hatred just is, but I'm not quite sure whether we should call that hatred. So I'm not quite sure whether corporations or technological complex systems really hate, so that the driving force there would be hatred. That we use technology, the latest since modern warfare, technology and before concentration camps, etc. I mean, you know, whatever, to enact a First World War or whatever kind of modern warfare, even before, use technology to enact hatred and to destroy accordingly. That's yeah, of course. But I still would not want to say that, you know, that hatred can be autonomously enacted by just simply technological social systems as such. But I guess this is anyway not what Anders means. But and then the survey, that's an amazingly great. It's really a great example, and I will come back to you to tell me the details. So I will look that up. I didn't know. I should have known.
You have it in Hungarian on Wikipedia also.
Yeah, that's great.
Facts.
Yeah, so I will look that up. That's a wonderful example. And I think how you analyzed it is definitely correct, but I don't see, maybe I'm seeing it wrong. As far as I can see, it doesn't necessarily contradict, at least, to this overgeneralization tendency. I think you are right. There is no straightforward overgeneralization because it's just a fictive community. This is what it's a wonderful example for what I've mentioned in the paper, just as that often hatred is precisely targeting imagined communities. This would be a clear-cut case, where it's even more complex because they are not imagined as imagined. They are just imagined or made up, where the people don't even know that they are imagined. But I think how still there is something like a stereotypification or overgeneralization in the extreme going on in some sense, is that they are constructed in the survey apparently as some kind of minority or ethnic group, some homogeneous ethnic group with a label. I mean, homogeneous in the sense that, you know, they've given a label, just as Russians and Arabs and, I don't know, Chinese, and they come to our country. So that's all there is to it. But that's enough to take precisely, as you said, this empty signifier, filling up this empty signifier with some imagined properties that are not really even imagined in any kind of concrete sense, because nobody knows who they are. Nobody has ever seen them. But this is very similar in the case of non-imagined. I mean, think of, I mean, a typical example that many always say aside when it comes to anti-Semitism, but also I guess and Hungary is a good example for it when it comes to anti-Islam sentiments or Arab sentiments. The people who have it have never ever seen, let alone talked, maybe seen, but not talked to, you know, groups of Arab people in some remote places in Hungary, maybe where there haven't been any immigrants. And often it is said, you know, that anti-Semitism, for example, flourishes in communities where there are no Jews and don't flourish. And so, I mean, this is also this context theory from social psychology. So, and I think this is what works here in a way too. There are no concrete properties, but the empty signifier is filled up with all this imaginary.
So you would say that this is still affection in a way? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But where precisely what happens is that there is no concrete, as you said, and this is the point I try to make. There is no import for me because I don't even know what they are and how they are. But I get the import by my commitment to hate anybody who is coming to this country as an ethnic group. And that I think shows pretty well. I mean, if it's the same, especially if it is a very comparable percentage, that clearly shows that it's just the commitment to anybody who fills this empty signifier. If it would be significantly less than Russians, then you could really argue, okay, well, it's strange, okay, they are hated, but you don't really know who they are, and then you hate them a little bit less, or less people hate them. But apparently it doesn't make any difference, because there is this commitment and we hate just anybody who comes. And that just shows that it doesn't matter what properties they have actually, because we don't even know whether they have any. Yeah. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, but thanks. They were really inspiring. Thanks a lot.
Jurgen?
Thank you. Thank you for a really inspiring work and article. It was difficult to follow, but I think that you made a point which is a provocative point, that hatred for the sake of hating, basically, is that what you're saying. It doesn't have a clear object, which I think it has also a gloomy vision, because if hater is invested in hating itself, then we cannot imagine the end of hating. I mean, what would be the process of de-hating, or how do you see the change in attitude would bring about the end of hate? So that would be my first question. And I have two more. They're very short and precise, so I hope they help you think through this. Throughout your presentation, I saw that there is, in a certain way, a tension between desire to hate and the hating or the act of hatred. So if you could elaborate a little bit more, because I think that there was a quote where one of the theoreticians says that if I have a desire to hate, it makes me a bad person. I don't see how a desire to hate can make me a bad person without the act of hatred. So to me it seems that there has to be the act of hatred in order to I actually become a hated person, because, and this would be the insight from psychoanalysis, the desire is always desire of the other, of the social symbolic. So I could have all kinds of desires that are not necessarily mine, but it seems to me that the act of hate, that you need some action or act that would constitute retroactively the bad person. So that would be the second question. And the third question, that it seems to me that in the case where hatred of evil is appropriate, I'm imagining if in this room were people from other disciplines or other schools of thought, there would be a lot of constraints on the justification of appropriateness to hate that Schmidt argues. And I'm thinking about, let's say if there is somebody from a human rights discourse, then there are cultural relativists, and then there is a context-based arguments that would be made. So my question, and I can completely imagine what would be the counter-argument, is that we have enough historical experience to say that there has been so many misuses of the appropriateness of hate. Take that penalty, for example, as the institution that one should groom in order to end hate, for example. So what would be your counter-argument to that? How would you respond to those kinds of constraints that would inevitably come from context, cultural relativism, and human rights discourse? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. These are also great points. So the end of hating, this is the first question. It's a tricky one, and I have this metaphor towards the end of the paper that in a way hatred is a perpetuum mobile, as it were, an effective perpetuum mobile. And by this I wanted to allude precisely to this problem that you mentioned. And I do think, if the analysis is right, that there is this commitment to hate, and the hatred derives its effective force by maintaining and upholding this commitment, and then especially in the group context, it's hard to come to an end of it. I think it's especially hard, and as I see it, this is something that history, unfortunately, and contemporary politics and intergroup conflicts teach us, or evidence, that especially when it comes to this sharing of the commitment and these reinforcement mechanisms and this collaborative spiraling of this, of maintaining the hatred through discourse, symbolic actions, etc., collective memories, narratives, etc., these so-called hate stories that we tell and we construe, this precisely serves and makes it difficult to end this spiral. How to do that? That's a good question. Well, I guess in a way, I mean, on a most general abstract level, I would want to argue by elaborating what is really at stake, precisely by elaborating what does really matter to the individuals or the groups in upholding this hate. And then they would realize, in many cases at least I think, that what matters or what they want to achieve is not achievable and not also appropriately targeted by hatred, but it would be targeted by resentment, indignation, contempt, moral outrage, etc., etc., but not by hatred. So it's a kind of a self-elaboration of the effective intentional structure that could end it, but this is a long process, and it should be done individually, but also precisely again on the public level, and it's very often not done. I mean, in the case of hatred towards, for example, refugees, I mean, what would be needed concretely is very clear discourses and concrete discourses. What are the fears? Why are those fears? Are fears, if there are any, that feed hatred, etc., are they legitimate? Are they appropriate to the numbers of people who are coming, etc., etc.? I mean, a complex process of rational but also effectively rational elucidation of what is the matter in hating these Piraeus people, where it turns out that there are no such, or Islamist terrorists, where it turns out that 99.9% of Arab immigrants who come are not Islamist terrorists, etc., etc. I mean, these are very obvious things, I think, but by elucidating that, that's not just a rational elucidation, it's also elucidating what does matter to us, why do we have these effective attitudes that we have. And I think by elucidating them, we might also change them. We might still have fear, etc., for example, but then it will be fear and not hatred. And then we can get on with that and discuss what to do. Then this is a really good question, and I guess I can answer it fairly easily because it was probably just misleadingly put, namely this tension between desire to hate and the act of hatred. It was probably just misleadingly put. I completely agree with you that it is, we should distinguish that. Maybe it's here the misleading formulation. So I agree, the desire to hate, why should that be inappropriate? But that's not what I mean. I mean that hatred as a desire to hurt or to eliminate, basically to eliminate the other. So that's the ultimate telos. And then still the act of eliminating the other, of killing or of mass genocide or whatever, or torturing, is still to be distinguished. Yes, I agree. But I think in a moral terms, the desire alone of annihilating, which is hatred, which is the act of hating, the desire, not necessarily the act of acting upon it, can still be discussed whether it's morally right or appropriate or not. So not the desire to hate, that's really another issue. But the hatred as a desire to really eliminate, fantasizing about eliminating, and then potentially also act upon the desires. Whether that's appropriate or not, I think is still a valid question. But it is true, I mean, of course, in all these play in desires that are not mine, that I'm taken over, that circulate, etc., where all kinds of psychoanalytic and other theories are helpful to consider, and that I haven't considered, and that is an interesting point. So I'm not quite sure whether this answers your question, but at least I would try to distinguish the three things. So the desire to hate, one thing, and I'm not talking about that at all. Then the desire that is the act of hating, the desire to humiliate, destroy, eliminate, murder the other or the others, and then the acting upon it, which is yet another thing. And the last question, if I remember correctly, so this Schmidt type cases of hating group agents, and this being very dangerous if you consider all kinds of cultural relativistic or other discourses. And then your example was capital punishment, right? So I think these are two different issues. So the first issue, I mean, it depends. So two different issues, if you mean by the capital punishment against, I mean, in the case of individuals. And there I would say that this view that hatred is appropriate under certain very limited and very restrained circumstances of group or corporate agents, compatible with that capital punishment of individuals is not appropriate in any case, which I personally would definitely endorse, but I think this is also absolutely in view with this view that hatred is never appropriate towards individual, and hatred is potentially the elimination of the other in murder or in capital punishment. So that can be excluded, I think, and should be excluded. But still, of course, you might, and many will, and with good reason sometimes, contest. Well, there are so many different values competing here, and so many different groups competing. So how to decide whether it can be at any case appropriate, or who decides about the appropriate, etc., etc. First, I mean, this is the big issue of moral universalism or relativism, and I can't really, obviously not solve that. But I'm not sure whether we should really go into that. But what I would want to say is that if there are certain, even relative moral standards, I mean, they mustn't be universal, but relative to certain culture or social culture context. And I think everybody would agree that there are some, at least local ones. Then hatred might be appropriate towards those collective or group agents that within that certain collective local social culture context harm or breach those moral norms. So we don't need, I think, necessarily universal values for that. That would be the short answer. Yeah, and then who decides whether those are breached or not? I mean, this is a matter of intersubjective and social deliberation, and there shouldn't be one person who decides that. But in many cases, it will be obvious if whole communities are hurt by a certain group agent, be it just that, you know, I don't know, whatever, a corporation privatizes the water supply, and it mustn't be genocide. It can full well be something like that, and that happens. That's a bad thing for many people in that community who can't afford, say, for example, clean water or something. And we should hate in the sense of really eliminate those, or set up cordon barriers. But thanks. There was a great intervention. Thanks a lot for all of you.
Thank you. We'll have a very short break. Okay, we are starting with the second panel, also with 3 interventions. From Marko Konjevic. Marko is currently finishing his PhD at the Central European University in Budapest on marriage. Then Olga Nikolic. Olga earned the MA at Leuven on Husserl about Noema, and currently working PhD on anticipation and probabilistic thinking, and at the end myself have some. So Marko.
And thanks a lot for this very interesting paper to read and a very interesting lecture. And the discussion was very interesting. Maybe you even anticipated some of my worries or questions in this lecture. So reading your paper and listening to the discussion here, it seems to me that you correctly and successfully identified what it means to hate, but, and this is the qualification, it seems to me that you identified that one kind of hate. Now, if we think about the examples of refugees that was very prominent in the discussion in your paper, so it seems to me that intuitively I would say that that is a specific kind of hate. We can call it prejudicial hate, because we distort some of the qualities in the target that may and most likely are not present. And as I was thinking, and now you anticipated that in your lecture, this idea of retributive hatred or moral hatred, I'm not sure if I would use them as synonyms. Maybe there's a difference between retributive and moral hatred. But if I just think about retributive hatred, it seems plausible to me to say that there are cases where we hate someone for the moral qualities or moral traits that we find deplorable. Now, of course, hate, as you rightly point out, has this very
extreme desire to annihilate or destroy the target, and we may or may not act on it. But it seems to me that this idea of retributive hate is an appropriate hate, especially once we make a distinction between the various senses of appropriateness. So it may not be morally appropriate, and you point that out here, but it actually may be a fitting form of hatred. And it seems to me that this idea of retributive hatred might actually be quite present, especially when we think about cases such as serial rapists. We don't necessarily, and this might be, and I haven't thought this through, but this might actually be the difference between the moral hatred and the retributive hatred. We don't necessarily hate the person as a way, because of their actions. We might actually hate the moral character. So a person may have a certain character trait that we find morally faulty, and this person may not even act on it, so there's no act to hate. With moral hatred, with the phrasing, I'm more inclined to say that it's actually a hate towards a violation of certain moral principles that are then transported through the person. So we identify the person with some more abstract moral principle, say a violation of justice. So that is the actual focus of our hate, the violations of some moral principles, or let's say we are talking about justice. With retributive hatred, I would say that it is actually directed at the person, period, and not to the actions or to the moral principles that the person acts on or represents. And that's why I might be inclined to say that, well, here's an example of hatred that is fitting, but perhaps morally inappropriate. So this is kind of a long comment. Actually, I wanted to ask, what are there various kinds of hatred? Do they make a difference? So is retributive hatred, on your view, a proper kind of hatred? And if it is different than what we might call prejudicial hatred, does that affect the idea that hatred can never be appropriate?
That's great, thanks a lot. And again, a difficult question. And I tend to rethink a little bit by now, given the discussion and given also my more recent research on these different senses of appropriateness of hatred, specifically since I wrote the paper, to rethink this issue whether hatred can, as I tended to argue and have kind of argued more or less also here, that it can never be appropriate. At least that type of hatred that I was discussing in the paper, this what we call prejudicial hatred. Having said this, I would try to answer the following way. What I wanted to do in the paper, and what I still want to maintain, is that even though this type of prejudicial collectivizing hatred is not the only possible type of hatred, and I've said that in the paper also, that this doesn't, I don't want to say that there is no interpersonal, that there's no possibility for interpersonal hatred, that hatred can only target these proxies or groups. But what I do want to maintain is that even in the interpersonal case, and that is also something you mentioned, tends to generalize to certain traits, call it character traits or global traits of persons, that generalizes to a degree that has similarities to this overgeneralizing socially overgeneralizing feature. So there is an inherent mechanism in every type of hatred, also in this interpersonal case, where the generalization of actions and specific traits of the other person, be having raped X, Y, Z women, generalizes and abstracts from that person to a degree that you hate the serial killer, and with that obviously all serial rapists in the case. And I think this is also in some way a little bit what Aristotle already had in mind when he said, he also made this distinction between hatred of individuals and hatred of what he calls their classes, and says that it's not that you cannot hate individuals, but typically it's a hatred directed toward classes. And then his example is the thief. You hate the thief, and you hate the thief, the individual thief, because of the theft that he committed, but you somehow at the same time conceive of this individual as a member of a class. And I don't think this membership is exactly the right way to view it. As I already said, it's more complex than that. But even on this interpersonal level, and if you think back of the quote that I started out in the paper, in the written paper, so I quote from this Roberts, from Robert Roberts' brief analysis of hatred, and he also starts with the abused wife. So a very concrete example, the abused wife who has a long list of reasons, of specific reasons for hating her husband. He has betrayed her or abused her, or whatever it is, a specific repeated act, and is a specific person, a specific relation. But then he goes on in the same sentence, but they come to trade, so these specific reasons come to trade descriptions. He's a nasty, inconsiderate, selfish person. And then he goes on, and so may the Palestinian or the Nazi for hating the Jew. The offenses, if they were at all, have by now been compiled into a trait, being a Jew, or being this horrible person that my husband is. And I think that is what I mean by this generalizing feature. And this tends to, I mean, it's prejudice wouldn't be the right way to conflate this with having prejudices against that person. But it kind of abstracts from the concrete sources and triggers of my hatred, which might have been very specific instances of harm. But it tends to abstract and accumulate them to a degree where it just becomes a general feature of this other person, this evil person. And there it resembles, I think, very much to this prejudicial type of hatred. So I agree with you, and I should be probably still more careful in distinguishing these types. But I do want to maintain that hatred always has this, at least this tendency, also the interpersonal, of having the same features as the prejudicial type.
Even retributive.
And then I come to, yeah, that's a good point. So the second point that you mentioned, which is about the distinction between retributive and non-retributive, and also within that moral and retributive. So I've used that more or less synonymously, retributive and moral, and they use it more or less. So actually, just so you know, the notion of moral hatred comes from Gene Hampton, and then Murphy reacts to that paper, and he kind of calls that what she calls moral hatred retributive. So they basically talk about the same, and then Hampton takes it up in a yet other paper, and which is called the retributive idea of moral hatred. So it's basically meant the same, but that doesn't matter. You made still the important, I think, distinction that you might distinguish them in the sense that one targets really the other person's moral character, the retributive one, I think you said, and that might be fitting. That was right what you, but not morally appropriate. And I find that a really interesting idea, and I think I would agree with you. and I would have to rethink then my claim that it's not fitting at all, hatred. And probably, and yet I would still want to kind of at least caution or maintain that even in this case you would have to then really look into it whether taking the whole other person's moral character as this unchangeable, uncorrectable, destroyable, or to be destroyed evil, because that's what it is, whether there are any kind of effective focuses that really kind of specifically can target that. So the question is really, is an evil moral character as such something that is a determinate anything? And that would be my question.
Right.
And I tend still to say that no, because then you would have to ask, okay, so what is it exactly in the serial rapist? Yes, the rapes and the incorrigibility and his non-remorse about the rapes, etc. All these are, you can characterize as evil or as horrific or whatever. And yet I do have a problem of talking still, even in this extreme case, about an evil moral character. I'm not, apart from the fact that it's not very useful, I think, for retribution. Because what do we want to punish there? I think, I mean, retribution is tightly linked to the idea of punishment. And the punishment here would be ultimately capital punishment. I mean, that would be the only adequate retributive idea, correct? I mean, if it is retributive hatred. And I think that's not the way to go. I mean, it's kind of the correcting evil with evil, you know, or correcting bad with bad in a way. I mean, that's the banal kind of style of argument against that, but still, it's really worthwhile to think that through. Thanks a lot, for differentiating that. Thanks.
Well, it's great. We haven't agreed in advance, but I also have a question about. My comment is also focused on types or kinds of hatred and how we should distinguish them. So I also have a comment on appropriateness. It seems to me that we have reasons to distinguish interpersonal type of hatred. So hatred that is directed towards individuals, a hatred that is directed towards concrete collectives and towards abstract collectives. I think there may be, so they are all types of hatred similar enough, but there may be some relevant structural differences concerning their targets and their focus that justify this distinction. So I will just mention some that came to my mind. First, an individual that hates another individual has this particular person as a target, okay? For example, because of the ressentiment towards that person. Even though there may be tendency to overgeneralize to other persons, and this is not the same generalization that you mentioned, but it is another tendency to other persons with similar characteristics. The intensity gets weaker, actually, with this generalization. So we may, and for example, somebody hates his ex, sees a person that reminds him, for whatever reason, of his ex, and he could have some sort of transfer or an aggressive reaction towards this person, but, you know, only in really pathological cases would we see an intensive reaction. So the focus is here ourselves, our hurt self-esteem. We are the ones who feel betrayed or feel that this other person took away something from us, etc., etc. So yes, this I wanted to stress, like the first distinction. On the other hand, when our target is the group, often we don't have this personal relation, of course, with those who we hate. And sometimes when we meet individual members of the group, we don't hate them, but we still hate the group. So it's kind of reverse from the first case. We have we feel much less animosity towards individuals than towards this general collective. And because we can still say, okay, these are some exceptions, there are some exceptions, of course, but this collective is still our enemy, still dangerous for us. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that when in an individual case, I would maybe expect that by becoming habitualized, the hate would lose its effective force in time. That the strong emotions we felt in the beginning would fade, and this would be especially helpful since it is a destabilizing psychological state. We usually, and we see it as morally problematic, usually want to overcome it in time. And overcoming of this hatred has a liberating effect. So the effective force is there, and we are trying often to overcome it and not stay committed to it. But in the collective case, as you completely rightly point out, the reinforcement from others, because there usually is an entire collective that reinforces our hatred towards another collective, actually makes this habitualized hatred more intensive in time and not less intensive. So this is another difference that came to my mind. And now I have a comment about the retributive hate. So when we hate a collective, sometimes it happens because members of one collective do terrible things to members of the other. And in these cases, I mean, yesterday we discussed this great book that I recommend to you. It's Violence as a Generative Force, and it explains how actually these acts of violence produced ethnic hatred, generated it, and ultimately the victims became the perpetrators of later acts of horrendous violence. And the key word that the author used to explain their motivation is retribution. Now, here obviously overgeneralization took place, so they didn't just target the perpetrators of earlier violence, but the entire ethnic group in this act of retribution. So this was morally wrong, completely morally wrong. But I think that, and this is where I agree actually with your conclusion, hate is an adequate response of a victim, if you're a victim of violence, but not towards all members of the other collective, but towards the perpetrators. So this evil collective that you mentioned, corporation, is one example, and the evil collective was the other. So if there is a collective that, an organized violent group that is doing something, the victim is justified in hating and wanting some sort of retribution. And this is where I actually don't agree with that part of your text where you claim that hatred is not retributive or does not involve retributive measures, and that it is not a reactive attitude, because I think it can be, and the restoration of justice can be the motive for those, one of the motives for those who hate. And finally, about overgeneralization and indeterminacy of the object of hatred. Of course, there is a tendency to overgeneralize and so on, but there is also a case where we can hate very particular groups for very particular reasons, right? So very determinate. We have very determinate reasons to hate this particular group, for example. And sometimes properties that we attribute to the hate-worthy object, for example, an ethnic or a religious group, are so determinate that they can turn this group into an imaginary enemy that nevertheless becomes so real for those who believe it that they start targeting all individuals that belong to the group, to the enemy group. However, sometimes these properties are sufficiently indeterminate so as to allow for the haters to in fact make distinctions within the group, to actually not feel hate towards individuals, which may in fact help to overcome hate towards the collective via encounter with the individuals, in some cases. So, to conclude about kinds of hatred, you mentioned this distinction that Kolnai makes, more personally and more abstractly directed hatred. I think this is a step in the right direction. They seem to be different, and the remedies seem to be different. Abstract hatred can sometimes be combated successfully simply by spending some time learning about the community of others, dispelling certain illusions about them, meeting them as real persons, not as imaginary enemies. But sometimes personal reasons are too strong, or enemies are not in fact imaginary, and then hatred can be overcome if the perpetrators are punished, or if the victim is able to overcome it on a personal emotional level by, for example, forgiving the perpetrator. Okay, so that's the end.
Thanks so much. Again, great comments. Very difficult to tackle, I think. Where do I start? First of all, I really like your distinction between this interpersonal, concrete and abstract hatred, and also targets, so where the targets are abstract or concrete, and how they also, I think, I mean, if I understood you correctly, or kind of it was implicit in your comment that these might also, of course, shift within more or less the same situation. And I mean, this example from the book Violence as a Generative Force might be such an example, where kind of a concrete harm, or a harm to a concrete person, but done by a collective, or in the name of a collective or an ideology, kind of starts at this interpersonal level, but then transforms itself in hating the whole group. The remedy can be kind of the remedy for the victim can also be shifting whether the individual or the group is, as it were, punished. I mean, I'm not sure whether, I mean, I think just that this was implicit, at least in what you said, and this I find a very interesting dynamics that I should take into account, and I haven't at all. So I also agree with you, and I if I would write that paper again, or would write another paper on interpersonal types of hatred, I should really take into account this idea that you mentioned, that I find really compelling at the beginning, that the overgeneralization, if there is any in the interpersonal case, loses its force by transference, except in psychopathological cases, you know, where you are so haunted, I don't know, by hatred to your ex-husband, wife, whatever, that you just transfer it to all the other relationships, etc. But in normal cases you wouldn't, and it loses its intensity. I think that's an interesting idea, and that is definitely so. But So the second point, I mean, then this all relates, I think, to this, to these distinctions also that you made between the groups. So how to overcome hatred? Is it by and these different types of hatred? Is it to overcome the collective type or this abstract, the hatred toward the abstract collections, by meeting concrete individuals or not? Wouldn't that be actually the solution? And following from this analysis, and also there are strong intuitions that this is how it works, this would be the way to do it, and this would actually follow from the conceptual analysis in a way. So if it is overgeneralizing, and by that share this overgeneralization with others, then actually the remedy must be to see whether these hate-worthy features apply to individuals, and by meeting them and seeing that it doesn't, then you could overcome it. Now, I don't know very much the literature. I know it a little bit, the literature in social psychology on this. This is this famous also context theory to remedy prejudices, and also prejudices involved in hatred. And this has been quite influential for a while, but there are just empirically, it's really also not decided. I mean, that wasn't your point now, and your point wasn't an empirical one, but I find it still quite interesting that empirically it is controversial whether this is really helping or worsening the situation. So sometimes, and I'm not saying that there are conclusive arguments to any side, but as far as I know from review articles, it's just not resolved in social psychology, this issue, whether this really helps. The reason why it might not help, which is, it seems counterintuitive, but the reason why it might not help, because sometimes, paradoxically, you find that the mechanism that stereotypes that are abstract and overgeneralized, but you tend to, in meeting concrete individuals, you tend to just corroborate you project your stereotypes on them and see in concrete individuals just your stereotypes confirmed. So think of, I don't know, people living in, what does contact theory here means? That you get into contact with groups that you have stereotypically created, and then you see how they live, etc. I don't know, say you move into the neighborhood of a minority group, or you are the minority and it's a majority group, it doesn't matter. And then you kind of, for whatever reasons, you pick out saliently those features in their behavior that accord with your stereotypes, and that just reconfirms it. So this might also happen, paradoxically. I'm not saying that this needs to happen, it can also be the inverse effect, but sometimes this does happen, and then it gets even worse.
I just wanted to add something, because we are having a discussion at the collective level, but I have this impulse to try to focus discussion towards more custom-made approach to basically replace it at the individual level. And to do so, I would like to refer to the concept of restorative justice. So how would you correlate hate and restorative justice? And I'm just looking for your basic intuitions here, nothing more. So.
Yeah, no, great, thanks. No, that is a great and important topic, and I mentioned minimally restorative justice in yesterday's talk, and of course it makes sense here in terms of retributive hatred. So yesterday's talk about ressentiment and resentment. The very brief answer would be that I think hatred is not the right appropriate emotion or sentiment when it comes to restorative justice, but resentment, indignation, etc. Because again, especially when the issue is to restore the functioning of the society as such, even in the face of horrible war crimes, as it often is the case, then I think the appropriate issue shouldn't be to destroy the enemy. And that would solve then, because that is the telos of hatred. So we should, I think this is really important. I also, and that's why I find this retributive hatred conception interesting, but ultimately problematic from Murphy and Hampton. Because we should never forget, I mean, if you really talk about hatred, if hatred has something distinctive to it as compared to contempt, anger, moral outrage, resentment, then ultimately the distinction is also not just to focus, etc., but it's telos. So what is it aiming for? What is the desire in hatred? It's to at least ridicule, humiliate, distance yourself physically, and ultimately to destroy, to eliminate from the face of the earth, as it were, metaphorically speaking, the other or the others. And when it comes then to retributive justice in a societal political context, I don't think that can be the right way to restore justice. It might be a punishment, and it is a punishment of parts of the society. But so if we look at this, I mean, this would be this is how retributive justice, according to Murphy, for example, would look like. Yes, if it's really just, the criminal should suffer to the degree that is worth of the crime committed, constrained by all kinds of moral decency and alert mind, and then you might say, okay, well, this has some kind of retributive justice function then, but I'm not sure whether this then is really hatred still, actually, to be honest. So this attitude. So does this resemble, this attitude, really the hate, where the hate is inciting terrorism, wars, genocide, etc.? I think these are two different things. This is really a moral outrage, a moral stance, and you might call it moral hatred or retributive, but I think it loses its specificity. Yeah.
Well, what I found interesting in contemporary anthropological theoretical work is the idea to try to explain all violence as a moral issue, as a motivation to all of this, to create, to sustain, to end, and ultimately to honor relationships. And while you have authors like Kant that has written about it extensively, trying to show all the different examples that expand our historical period, as well as different types of violence, to create that sort of embellishment. So. I see your point, and it is a very tricky issue, and I don't want to take really a stance on justification of violence, and I mean the whole issue of just war. I mean, you have this in the just war discussion, of course. Then that's a huge discussion that I'm also not familiar at all with. And that goes into that direction, but I think what still remains the difference to hatred, that hatred, again, I'm just repeating myself, if it is true that hatred is distinctive in the sense that it is targeting elimination of as such, and not just correction of through whatever means, be it violence also, like just war. You need, according to some certain forms of restrained violence in order to keep peace, basically, or to restore justice. But hatred is more and different, so maybe I should mention that, which is in the paper, but which I haven't really prominently mentioned so far.
hatred is also distinctive in the sense that, I mean, usually, at least this non-retributive type, is precisely not targeting correction of wrongs, or not just not targeting, but its aim is not to correct the evil, but just to eliminate the evil. So if that is really a good characterization of hatred, and I think it is, then it almost in principle can't be really used for retributive or restorative, at least. Maybe for retributive, but not for restorative justice.
But certainly I would say that this, which you just said, is actually difficult to also because of the growth of the ISIS having this extreme terrorist.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would agree. I mean, if it is true, and I guess it is true. I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but the ideology of ISIS is not geared at, you know, convincing other people of their of faith or of certain values, etc., but to eliminate all the others who aren't. And in that sense, that is a hatred based and precisely not geared at correcting certain, but just enforcing certain values against others. Yeah, obviously, it's also not in any sense restorative justice conducive, as we know. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Just to come back to the last, I mean, I think this links up with if I noted it correctly, your last point about the determinate object. So might not there be very well a determinate object that we hate in also in specific groups, right? That was, I think, the last point. Yeah. And then it, why wouldn't it then be appropriate and in the sense of also and a fitting and appropriate attitude, and also morally right if the specific feature is a moral evil?
Yes, and let's say in the case of evil politeness, for example, fascists killed and if some innocent people later decided to rebel, then I could really want to justify.
Yes, I mean, I can really just repeat myself. I agree. I tend to agree more and more. I probably still want to maintain that. I mean, on the one hand, I said in the talk that yes, this would be the cases where I think it's morally appropriate stance when it comes to groups. So this would be this group agent case, corporate or group agent or evil collective case, and there it is morally justified. Even maybe we have some duty in some cases. Whether that also means that the focus then is really a determinate one, I think is another matter, and probably in most cases it is. But even there, maybe. Even there, where if it is really hatred, it tends probably even to kind of blow up this determinate, specific wrong into the discourse that we're talking about, an evil collective, which is then as such, which might not be a problem in that case. I agree, because we want to eliminate them, and we should in some cases. But even there, probably the focus gets blurry sometimes, or more or less indeterminate, even if it starts with a concrete. And I would also not want to say, in the case even of individuals or so it might very well be that, and it is very often so, that the triggers and sources, the initial ones of hatred, might be very determinate action or very concrete actions. But then this whole process sets out. So it might be that the concrete torturer who tortured me, and that is really what I hate. But But first of all, I don't think that hate is in this, and people don't also, I mean, torture victims don't speak of hate. They speak of shame, of anger, of all these kind of other emotions usually. And then it might generalize into hate. But it's, I think, not by coincidence that typically victims of these horrible, and also rape victims, it's not hate that they talk about as their initial. It then turns into that, might do that and consume your whole life with feelings of revenge, etc. But it's a later stage. But that's just a side remark. But thanks so much. I'm afraid I didn't answer your subtle differences, but yeah. Let's do that.
We have a short comment.
Short question. So I was thinking something about this issue of hatred towards hate. So, and I was just, first of all, it seems in some sense analogous to the liar's paradox. So you have, I hate towards others that accept the hate against all others. So basically what this suggests, I mean, I'm just running out of that here, that is that you need to have some second order volition here introduced in order to resolve this tension. So in essence, what I'm asking is, can you have this kind of second order, higher order volition directed towards some practical? In other words, can you love hating someone, hate loving someone, and stuff like that?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. Short answer, I think definitely, and I hope to write at some point a paper, and I have just very vague ideas about that, but about this kind of meta emotions, not concerning hate, but in general, which I'm not the only one who is doing that. It's a kind of a new discussion, which wouldn't be volitions, but really second order emotions, or meta emotions, emotions targeting emotions, your own or maybe not your own, but. And I definitely do think not only that they exist, but that they are crucial, I think, for us being full-fledged persons. Because if we would have only emotions floating around and hating and loving and whatever, but don't have any effective emotion or emotional stances towards our own emotions, we are not like that. We do have that. We regret having hated, or whatever. We criticize ourselves and feel remorse or hate ourselves, maybe not hate, but kind of have aversion against ourselves for having had certain kind of feelings, or are ashamed of envying, etc., etc. And I think these are crucial for shaping, modulating, criticizing, changing our emotions, and the same would go, I think, for hatred. Whether it's really a hate of hatred, we discussed that. There, I don't know. I think the two types of hatred would be a little bit probably different. So the one would be this over-consuming hatred, I don't know, towards whatever, African Americans, and then the other one would be your own moral outrage about this stance that you inherited and that you can't escape, or something like that. It wouldn't be the same kind of type of hatred, I think, but in principle, yes, yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, and now I will have some comments or trying to get some questions. I also start from person-focused hate, although I agree that hatred, as you explained, is probably specific and important social phenomena. I'm not sure that they're actually the same phenomena as interpersonal hate. I'm actually really not sure. But why I'm starting with person-focused hate, and probably could we speak of a plural person-focused hate, is because I think that there are specific arguments about taking up appropriateness or justifying person-focused emotions as love and hate that are not always as easy or different than, so justifying love or making explanation why love to someone is appropriate is different than saying why it's appropriate to be afraid of a dog. And I mostly use some argument, of course, with a full awareness that love and hate are different phenomena, and actually from this point probably coming mostly to the same conclusion, but also putting some other questions that we probably think of. So for those who are not familiar, person-focused emotions, like in sense in Helm explaining, are, for example, being proud, mostly we know it as being proud of myself, and one important part of it, which should be addressed, that if I'm proud of being professor, or being father, being professor, being father, in that case, if they're person-focused, being proud, are not just some independent values, but a part of my patterns analysis perspective, which constitutes something like my identity. So I'm proud not just for some independent value being professor, but as a part of myself, where the being professor, being father is my focuses. And what is more important when we speak about hate, the other directive, so I can be proud on the other person's behalf. So if I, for example, if I have some relation, friendship with Mark, and Mark get his work on analytical metaphysics published in a good journal, I could be proud on behalf of Mark, even if I don't care about analytical metaphysics and nothing on, in a way in which Mark is proud of his success. So, and that was also the basic argument for love and Helm. So love constitutes an intimate identification in which I care and concern for this person as such, taking care and concern for what she cares for. Like in the example of a daughter and social, I should, if I love my daughter, I'm in such a relation that I should be proud and care for her winning the basketball game, although personally I hate basketball and so on. So what here kind of the problem with justification? One problem with justification can claim it in the same time that love has to be justified and autonomous. So it has to leave something from my autonomy and be justified in a way that there is something appropriate for me loving some other person, and in loving some other person I don't love some particular values of the person, but that person as such. And the broad definition that person is someone who has the capacity to autonomously deliberate about her own values. So to put it in short, one argument that probably could be questioned here, what Ken said, it could be justified on this, let's say, objective level, only if this, so loving person as such, not caring, for example, that some person I don't know have some values I'm also taken positively, but loving person as such presuppose that these values I'm valuing are part of this person's identity in some way, mostly that it expresses. So in this case, probably the question could be, should we make a clear difference, as I mentioned a few times during this discussion. It's not the same if I, let's say, hate Serbs or hate Croats, or if I hate those particular Croats or those particular Serbs who, for example, taking as part of their identity pro-fascist history in the Balkan, which I have negative values. So it's a question that are we even, if it's possible to hate person as such, are we taking something that is part of her identity of person or not? So when I hate Croats, I'll say, oh, Croats make some more generalization, but certainly there are some people who at least express as a part of their identity some characteristics that I could hate. Mm-hmm. And the second question here can make a differentiation between discernment problem, which he defined what if anything justify that it came to it that I love some person and not the other, taking time resistance and so on. And we could also ask a similar question about hate, but what is important, I think that all questions we have about probable appropriation, even ethical, of hate, we talked about how it came that we hate. And the second question, which is probably more important, and he wants to say that there are two different questions, is constancy problem. What, if anything, justify that I'm to continue to love some person, even if that person and situation and myself changed? And part of his important argument, let's say, part of my self-determinacy loving someone is that actually I exercise this kind of this kind of intimate identification with other person. I actually being proud when she did her values and in some way sharing her values, and actually the exercise of this intimate identification and interpersonal relation is what justify that I continue to love this person even if she change. So I probably have a friend from childhood with very intimate relation and continues. He changed during his life, probably together changed, but the intimate relation and identification with this person during time in some way justify why I continue to love this person. Of course, it could also be unjustified in cases that I cannot anymore exercise this intimate relation. I cannot make anymore any identification with the values this person. So the second question is, should we make the same distinction from the hatred? And it seems that it's much harder to defend that we should, in any case, continue to hate any person. So I will try to make the things also a bit complicated. I'm not sure if it's convenient enough, but probably it could be an argument why actually the focus is blurred and why it all could not work with hate. I think it has some similarities with the Scheller's argument you mentioned, but what I think is important when we speak about phenomenology of emotions and the emotions are engagement with, in this case, persons, is to take seriously positive or negative violence, especially when it's in such a positive and negative balance as love and hate. So, for example, in Helm, it's actually, she doesn't simply say, we are valuing something positively or negatively, so positive import is related to something that is worth pursuing, and negative is something that is word of avoidance, that immediately make different engagements with the object. By Kant, for example, it is even more radical. This pleasure is a state in which the state of representing has a tendency to turn into its own opposite, and of course, in practically all cases, combine it with aversion to get rid of it, to destroy it. It's also mentioned. But the point here is not only, let's say, objectively spoken, someone wants to destroy someone. It is the type of engagement we have with our person and the other person is such is a different. One is in love, getting into the intimate identification, taking care of this person cares and so on, while on in the other case, in the case of hate, where there is negative violence, we are actually getting into engagement with the person as such to get rid of it, to destroy it. Or because also be different in a term of tautological spaces. So what happens in engagement with a person who we hate is absolute inability to get into any even minimal intimate relation, as for example respect or trust. So any possibility that we could enter into a relation in which we identified with the values or take care with the values, or take this person's capacity to autonomously value and deliberate about values is kind of a closed path. And I think that in case of hate, it probably had to do something with why the focus is blurred, because in some way hate promises the discovery of a person as such, which in Helen's case actually love is giving. So by loving someone, entering in the intimate identification in which you are discovering other person as such, and hate is promising other person as such, but that is actually what is getting rid of and blurring. And probably for that reason, I just shortly try to give some conclusion on some question that. So it looked like that justification, if any, when it's given to either how it came to hate someone or why continue, is not related to the what is present or what is felt in emotional engagement with the person that I hate him. So it could be some additional information that I can reflect about. It could be some prior or connected emotion like anger, but what we are explaining is never actually the relation which we have with that person, because the relation we have is get rid of it. I'm not sure it's committing, and by that this didn't mean that we don't have some epistemic information. So when I hate Heinrich Himmler, I could get all the possible information about Himmler, and probably all this information will trigger my hate, but effectively when I'm engaged, I don't get in any identification with Himmler as a person. She's not trying to respect or trust his evaluation. Regarding consistency, because there is no intimate identification which could justify continuing to hate someone, because in case of love, it is the exercise of the intimate relation that justifies that I continue someone even if it changed, because here there is no any relation practically besides negative one. I think that it could be hard to argue that there is any argument to continue to hate someone even this person changed. And something that I'm scared to say, but I need to say it's also related that you mentioned that probably in society where there are moral or commoner norms, it becomes reasonable and makes sense why hate happens. But I also think, so why we are simply when we are incapable or not having any import we are incapable to take in position that some person have capacity to deliberate about values, and we are incapable to make any respect or identification with this person as such, why we simply not avoid it or just vaccine. And probably I think that it's also social phenomena that in a way that if this person values are actually in conflict, are such a way that we could even make minimal identification in which could deliberate together about values. We cannot do so, but the values are, let's say, a treat in a society we live. So if tomorrow we wake up and see the Nazi analogy against waking up, so we cannot, and we seem incapable of deliberating about values with Nazis, so probably the hate is some expression of, or probably some mechanism, following from some mechanism of resentment, but I see that probably this being in a social context makes sense why hate happens, whether it's justified in any way or not. And I have one more question or comment, or trying to look optimistically on the question what to do. So, for example, as you given 2 days before the example of people in Alabama who actually doing some things because of the word that their identity as a group have for them, as I could understand. And it seems to me that if there is this kind of, let's say, attitude or commitment, it looks like that so if hate is habituated in some society, it looks like that I live in this society and I recognize that being committed to the attitude to hate, for example, the other ethnicity, is a part of our shared values in some way, and that because this group has input for me. I'm not so ready to leave the whole group and leave the shared values we have. So probably one of also Helm's argument, just to end with something more optimistic, if it is, against Gilbert, that we actually could have joint reason to deliberate about content of joint commitments, or if it makes any sense. So what we will do when we recognize that we live in a group that we care for, but it has something like a strong commitment to the attitudes to hate the other group. So probably trying to discover if it's actually value for us.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks a lot again for these rich comments and criticisms. I really like the idea taking Helm's idea about love and intimate identification to see how it cashes out in hatred. That's really, I haven't thought of that at all, and I find it really interesting. So try to be fair to your points and go through some of them at least. So the first was, if I remember correctly, about whether the hate-worthy features, as it were, must be really a part, as it is in love, of the other's personal and social identity. So really a core feature of it. That was the issue, right? Not just that hatred must be, so that the hated because of, say, of moral reasons or whatever, or some values that I, not necessarily moral lifestyle that I hate in the other, are really important for my own personal
or for their
that was rather the question, whether they're. I would say in both cases it is crucial. So this is a similarity, I would say, to love. And what it shows is also that I construe the others. I think this is what happens precisely in hatred, that I construe the other as a whole around this one feature that I hate. So I take the other to be nothing but that hated feature, and that's precisely the problem also. So in that sense, definitely, it is even more than in love, I would say. So in love, it's probably a complex of core values that that are important, that the other exhibits in order for me to love the other person. And if they all disappear, then I will at some point stop loving the other person, probably. But in hatred, it takes just this hated feature, the whole prevalence, whatever it is, I don't know. So there I would definitely say, and even I think it's even more extreme than in love. And this relates a bit to this constancy problem. I think the difference is, so there is a similarity to love again, and a difference. So the similarity is that the reasons are under quotation marks, if there are reasons to love. I don't really think there are, but I mean, Helm tends sometimes to go into that direction. I mean, not straightforward reasons, rational reasons, but at least the values are the reasons for love, if you will. And I think the difference between love and hate is that those reasons, those specifically targeted values, are more blurred in hatred than in love. Tendentially, it's also not always quite clear in love, of course, because it's also a global attitude. You love the whole person with all these values, and you won't love a person in the sense of this intimate identification just because this other person is brave or great or amicable or friendly. This won't be enough. So but still, it is, I think, maybe a little bit clearer than in hatred. But be it as it may, the difference, I think, or maybe one other similarity, but also difference, to a certain degree, I mean it's a matter of degree, is that in hatred you seek out constantly, you don't care about the changes, you don't think that the other, I think this is also a feature that I haven't really mentioned so explicitly so far, but which is also mentioned in the paper. Hatred is also characterized by the fact that you are convinced that the other person is evil, because that also means that evil can't change. Evil is evil. I mean, evil means also, if somebody is an evil person, that person won't change, is incorrigible, and you don't expect that certain disvalues will disappear, and then just hatred remains, which is also not geared to correct other person's faults, but precisely to eliminate them, because you believe that they can't change, whether it's individuals or groups. Whatever, you know, this person will always be a bad person, or this group will always be horrible or dangerous or whatever. And so that's so much this constancy thing. Intimate identification, this is really tricky. I think there it's of course you are right, and I think that's really a good point to make also very clear difference, that in hatred you precisely do everything not to have the intimate identification, obviously, and to avoid also contact, and that's also the telos of hatred, to break off contact, and by either eliminating or distancing yourself or removing yourself or moving away from the neighborhood or whatever. And yet I think you have some kind of version of this intimate identification, but what I have called with, or Konai calls, what I referred to by Konai, and also Sarah Ahmed has a really interesting capture of that, by this effective alignment with the other. So, or this existential alignment or existential link, how Konai calls it. So you need, so you kind of intimately, in some sense, even though it's a hostile, but that's why I call about this negative alignment. So it's a hostile alignment, but you need the other in order to uphold, of course, this hatred, which is also serving you in some sense to define, partly at least only, but still your social identity. And in the group context, similarly, you are so invested, you are effectively invested. In that sense, you intimately identify in some sense.
You're intimately identified, but not in a way of getting into, let's say, other person constitutional values, but in a way that you are, let's say, I would call it be anti-focused. So your attention is so deep, but in a way to get rid of it.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. So of course, it's an opposite kind of identification, if you will. Identification is probably not the right term. It's a negative alignment or negative, but the dynamic is in a way similar, just in that respect that as in love, you need, if it's, say, for example, romantic love or also other kinds of love, the target is really part of your existential or your personal identity. And partly this is also so in hatred, at least your social identity. It won't be your personal identity, but partly if there is really a group or a person that you deeply hate, then this will be important for your personal and especially social identity. But at the same time, what to do, I mean, this was kind of the last idea, if I remember, because it hinders precisely, but hatred hinders that you get into contact and then discover maybe or correct these values. And there, yes, I definitely agree. And that is a big difference, obviously, to love, but it's the opposite. No, but I really like this, and it is very common in the literature, of course, to think about, and Sheila does that, and many do that, of course, think about analogies and disanalogies between love and hate. But what I find really interesting in this suggestion, really to look into Helm's theory specifically, and it's a really good point. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I have just a short question.
Okay. I'll but really short. Yeah.
No, just one question.
Yeah.
Can hatred engage other people?
Can hatred
engage others? So if I hate some objects, or if I have a hatred toward a object, can then engage others people to hate the same object?
Very brief answer. First of all, I don't think that you can hate objects. That hatred of objects is really a proper form of hatred. I think you can only hate persons. But still, the question is still valid. Can I engage other people if to hate other persons? And yes, I definitely think so. I think that's a typical case actually, that we try and do everything to engage other people. Maybe we fail, but often we don't, unfortunately, and then our hatred and those of our groups just get worse. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.